With that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff to give an overview of planokc and the phase one report. And I'm going to be driving the presentation, so Jeff will be cueing me throughout. So Jeff, take it away.
All right, thank you, Lisa. And thank you all for joining us. Very excited to get this process going. I'm the kind of guy that gets excited about code updates, and I think that we all must share a little bit of that because we're all here. And so I appreciate your assistance and your acceptance of the mayor's invitation. It'll be a thorough process, and I'm excited that we have such a good variety of perspectives and backgrounds. I appreciated hearing all of your thoughts. Obviously, we have a lot to accomplish, but we are excited to be underway. So we have a limited amount of time today. This is just our kickoff meeting, just so that we can get to know each other a little bit. I know it's not ideal meeting like this, but hopefully at some point we can get together and at least bump elbows and maybe shake hands at some point. That'll come, but in the meantime, we'll do this method, and it does have its advantages. We can show you visuals, and that's going to be a big part of this project. So without further ado, I'll give a brief intro into planokc because it really is the foundation of what we're doing. It's the starting point. It provides the direction for us. Like so many of you mentioned, many of the comments that were given earlier are reflected in planokc. So if you go to the next slide, Lisa, I'll dig into that. So when we did planokc, we did just a lot of outreach, a lot of surveys, public workshops, you name it, we did it just to try and get the pulse of the community, all parts of the community. Many of you were involved in focus groups or workshops or some kind of activity designed to get your feedback. And we came up with what we feel is a good plan, very good plan. In fact, it did win a national award won the Daniel Burnham Award from the American Planning Association, which is given annually to the best comprehensive plan. But more importantly, it represents what our community aspirations are and our desires and what we feel like needs to happen to get there. So we did a scenario planning process, which basically said, hey, we need to accommodate a lot of growth. We need to fit hundreds of thousands of people into the city over the coming decades. How are we going to do that? Are we going to do kind of past trends continued, which you see is scenario A here? Are we going to do scenario C, which is a more kind of the most efficient growth pattern that we thought we could feasibly do, or somewhere in the middle, which is scenario B. So if you can go to the next slide, Lisa. So we had some visuals that kind of helped people understand what we meant by that and what it would mean. And it's important to realize in these different scenarios, and as we go through this code update, that we did our homework. We did a housing market study, retail market study, a whole bunch of studies, including this scenarios analysis, to determine what the need was and what people actually wanted, because our goal was to accommodate everybody's needs. The future of our city, it was made clear to us that we need to have housing, which is a big driver of land use, how land is used in the metro and in our city. We need to have situations, housing product that meets everybody's needs. And we have 621 square miles. We go from very rural to very urban. And we want to continue to do that. And so what you see here is kind of different ways of dividing up the city, so to speak, to accommodate those different needs. And each one of those accommodates the housing types that people wanted, including and especially scenario C, which accommodates all the single family homes that were projected to be needed, all the rural development that was projected to be needed. The key difference between that and the other scenarios is that it's just more efficient. It's focused on infill. And that was a big important part of Plan OKC is accommodating successful infill. And there were a lot of your comments reflected that. If you can go to the next slide, Lisa. So what we did is we showed people these three scenarios and how they perform. We talked, many of you mentioned sustainability. That was, of course, an important part of what we were looking at. If we were to build more efficiently, what does that do for our bottom line? That's important to all of us, and it turns out that, if we build scenario C versus scenario A, we could save $80 million a year. And even with a city the size with a budget that we do, that's a chunk of change that we could use to provide, better parks or better transit or whatever it might be. So I encourage you all to look at Plan OKC. We've only got a few minutes today just to give you a brief overview, but all of this is in there. I encourage you to go look at planokc.org and peruse that. You can download a PDF. You can look at the web version either way you like. But this just wanted to give you a kind of what the guts of the plan, so to speak, are. If we build the way we think we can and have the policies and the regulations to do it, we can make everybody happy. That sounds like pie in the sky, but we really can accommodate all the needs that we have in the city, and at the same time, reduce the amount of pollution, increase walkability, and decrease the amount of money that we have to spend to maintain roads and so forth, while still providing all of the infrastructure needed for new greenfield development and infill. Next slide, please, Lisa. So there was the preference. At the end of the day, we took a survey and asked everybody, once they had been informed, attended workshops, they took this survey. We also provided the survey outside the workshop with some detailed information so that people could take it after being informed about kind of the things I just talked through and the chart you just saw. And they overwhelmingly preferred scenario C, which frankly was a little bit of a surprise to us. We thought we might get, more people that wanted somewhere in between. So if you go to the next slide, Lisa, knowing that, having done all that outreach and receiving all that input, we came up with some big ideas and a land use plan, which really formed the core of Plan OKC. It was important to our citizens, our residents, our businesses to develop a transportation system that works for everyone. In other words, a multimodal system so that people can walk, bike, ride transit, or drive. Housing choice was very important to people, being able to live in a good neighborhood with a diversity of housing choice, good schools, healthy citizens, build an environment that incorporates and accommodates health and wellness, so opportunities for people to kind of naturally, do human things like walking and running and biking, not make it difficult to do that. Community attractiveness is very, very important to people, placemaking, and that'll be an important theme as we develop our code. Thriving neighborhoods, efficiency, which we've touched on, and natural character, which was also touched on in some of your comments. Being able to preserve these natural resources, not only on the fringe of the city, but in urban environments as appropriate. That looks different in highly urban environments than it does in suburban areas, and we'll get into that in detail. Clay, earlier you mentioned a desire to understand this better and for the public to understand the land use topology areas better. And we won't have time to get into this in depth today, but essentially this is the way that we approach how land should be used and at what intensity and densities in the city. And it really will inform our code update and really just kind of provides guidelines for what's appropriate and where. And we have, different levels, of course, from rural areas to different levels of urban areas, and this land use topology guides all of this. And there's a suite of policies that goes along with it, which we'll delve into as we go along. So I think the next slide has a few more examples of that, just kind of the different designations that we have and different things that are encouraged and allowed to happen in those areas. And there it is, all on one big map. That's Oklahoma City, all 621 square miles of it, going from the green areas, the different shades of green, the rural areas, to suburban, kind of the light yellow, and the urban in kind of the inner loop and around downtown. And as I said, we'll get into detail on what all this means and what it means for the code update. Another kind of fits hand in glove with the land use topology is the street topology system. And that, we wanted to make the point in planokc that land use and transportation are integrated and reliant on one another. That's just critical. So they really go together, and we really have to consider both when we make decisions. When the Planning Commission or the City Council just consider all kinds of decisions, that has to be taken into account. So that just wanted to draw your attention to that. Kind of wrapping up the planokc discussion, we have several initiative elements, and those include considerations, of course, about land use in general, transportation, environmental resources.
How much was it?
Communities and neighborhoods.
How much was it? Is it available? It's an Amazon.
We've got Enrich OKC, which is all about placemaking, preservation, appearance, Parks and Rec, In Play OKC, economic development, and public services. And those have a host of policies that really amount to, like I said earlier, how we're going to get to our end goal, the vision that the community has. And I wanted to talk about compatibility and its relationship to land use, because it is critical to how we're going to move forward with this code update. And this, for those of you who are a little more familiar with zoning, this may not be any news to you, but just for a little bit of history, I guess, the way that zoning has worked for a long period of time, for many decades, is that you separate uses. You put housing over here, and you put the hog farms over there, and you put the offices over there, so that there's no conflict between them. Well, that works sort of, but it also has a lot of downsides, and I think we can all see some of what those downsides are. What a lot of communities are doing, ours included, is going to a little more sophisticated system, and that requires a more sophisticated code, which doesn't mean it's more complicated. Like Einstein said, I believe it was Einstein, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but the simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. We're trying to have the best of both worlds, but compatibility is critical. We've got to, if we want to integrate uses, which is a goal of planokc, and somebody mentioned mixed use earlier, if we want to integrate those uses, have the ability to walk out your front door, walk down the street to your workplace, or ride your bike over to your favorite restaurant, or drive a car to your friend's house, which is just a short distance away, or your workplace a short distance away. We've got to make uses able to be compatible with one another without having to separate them drastically. And so that's really cornerstone of planokc. And it relates to the intensity of use, as you can see in this, this diagram here. It relates to transportation. You know, if we can successfully integrate use, that allows us to be more sustainable because there's less travel distances involved. People can take shorter trips. They can use their car less. So it all kind of works together. And this diagram, I think, this is in the early pages of planokc. It's a good primer on what we're trying to accomplish. Go to the next slide, Lisa. So I've got a couple more slides before my time is up, and then we'll kind of get to the nitty gritty of what we're going to do next, and we'll turn it over back to Lisa and Mark. We did, as was mentioned, a code diagnosis. That was the first phase, and it's just what it says, a diagnosis. What's wrong with our code? What can we do better? So in addition to implementing planokc through the code update, it's just as important to make the code user-friendly, easy to use, kind of predictable yet flexible. We smile about that because we want both. And so we'll do our best to get both. But what we found with the code diagnosis was that ineffective base zoning districts, that often leads to overuse of PUDs. You know, we want what we want, but we feel like our code and the consultant felt like our base zoning districts weren't adequate to get us there, which is why we have such a high amount of PUDs. I'm just going to highlight some of these, and I encourage you to take a look at this document on your own. We will have it on the project website, which Lisa can talk about, and we can of course provide any documents you all need at any time. They found that there are too many layers of regulation. Our parking regulations need work. Our subdivision standards are out of date. Just the structure of the document and the organization is kind of confusing, unnecessarily complex. The document itself, as well as the procedures and administration. So there's a lot to work on to make this better. And finally, the phase one recommendations, as you would expect, kind of the inverse of the problems that we have. Many cities have seen success with a highly graphic and user-friendly layout that makes it easy to understand what these regulations mean. So we're going to focus on that. Also a unified development code, so you're not constantly flipping back and forth to find what it is you need. You know, we're just going to really try and focus on something that makes a little more sense and has what you need in the right place. So we're expecting to have a hybrid code. There are lots of different kinds of codes, and we'll get into this more. You know, from form-based codes to performance-based codes to conventional codes. You know, we want to craft something that is hybrid, that works for us. All these different methods have advantages and disadvantages. So, and we'll use, you know, depending on what area of the city, we expect that we'll customize these codes for different areas. You know, people who are doing greenfield development in the suburbs have different needs than people who are doing infill in the core of the city. So our code should reflect that. So we want to be context sensitive, and that's what we mean by that. You know, the civic and open spaces are also important. We need to be careful about how we design and locate those. Sign standards, we're working on those right now. Clear procedures for administration and review, and consolidated nuisance standards. So those are just some things that were recommended. We're going to talk about signage here. I just used Mark doesn't like it when I say signage. Sign regulations. So I apologize for that, Mark.
It's okay.
But I'm going to hand it over to Mark. But just a quick. I guess, update on what we're doing first. The first kind of module we're doing because it's kind of a hot issue right now, is signs and billboards. And we've started some work on that, and we'll be bringing some information to you shortly. But I will hand it over to Mark, and he can talk us through kind of the phases in our process and what's coming next.
Thanks, Jeff. This is Mark White with White and Smith. And Lisa introduced us briefly early on. We're out of Kansas City, Charleston, and Dallas. Reese Wilson, who's on our phone, is on our call today, is in our Dallas office. And Reese is also an OU grad and has done some work in and around the city while he was a planning student there. So we're glad to have him on board. And you see the big arrow on the right that talks about public engagement. We're very fortunate to have Travis Pendleton from Vireo. They are a public engagement firm that we've worked with before on projects like this, because it's a neat trick sometimes to get everyone involved in talking about zoning, because at the end of the day, zoning's a legal document in a lot of ways. It's the city's authority to ask things of development. And so it's got to be written a certain way, and getting people excited and engaged and involved in that is very important. So we're thrilled to have Travis involved. And I also want to mention there's two other firms. Kendall Keast out of Houston is helping us. They also do code updates between the two of our firms. We've done over 300 codes all over the country. And they also bring with them an online coding tool called Encode that we're going to use to both write the code and to display it to the public when we're done. It's going to be hyperlinked. It has a lot of ways to access the code that aren't available today. And we also have Winter and Company. They're an urban design firm that we've used on a lot of our other projects that'll help us get the design issues right. All of that is important. So as Lisa mentioned, and as Jeff just went over, the city's already completed phase 1 of this process. It's a 3-phase process, and this is critically important, and that's why I appreciate everyone's involvement today, because as Jeff mentioned, you have an award-winning plan. It's beautiful, it's well written. I think when you read through planokc, you get a great sense of what this city is today and what it wants to become as it grows further and continues to grow and mature and et cetera. But plans don't implement themselves. We have to get our development regulations, zoning, subdivision, how we design buildings, how we lay out sites, how we design streets and et cetera. We have to get all of that right for everything you see in planokc to become reality in the future. So the diagnosis did a great job of analyzing and pointing out things in the current code that are obstacles to that, regulatory barriers that we need to remove, regulatory tools we need to add in, et cetera. So it did a good job of laying out a blueprint for putting this plan implementation process in place. And so we're stepping in on phase 2. We actually did we toured the city in 2019, all the different neighborhoods from the rural areas to downtown to a lot of the special places around the city, like Paseo, for example. And so we got a sense of the city. The city started putting together this process, this group to help out with engagement. And we are leading off with different, as we go forward in phase 2, that's the drafting phase. So we're going to start putting together different pieces of this code because as the old saying goes, how do you eat an elephant? Well, one piece at a time. We want this code to be user-friendly. We want it to be something that makes it easy for you all, those of you involved in the development process, to find the information you need, all the way to somebody who's in a neighborhood and wants to find out what's going on and how the process works. It needs to be easy for them too. So we are but we're going to put all that together piece by piece because you're not going to be able to review an entire code at once and give us meaningful feedback. So we're going to unveil different pieces at a time so that all of you can focus and give us your sense of what seems to work well, what needs to change, and et cetera, so that by the time this lands on the Planning Commission's desk, we've gotten it right. So we're leading off the sign code. I'm going to talk about that in more detail in a second. We're going to talk about different code types. We're going to talk about the structure in the district. So that's going to be one of the first things we talk about in some meetings coming up, because that'll be the DNA for the rest of the code. That'll tell us how we shape our buildings, our sites, our streets, our parks, our everything, even stormwater facilities. That's going to work differently in the different typology areas that will drive what the zoning districts look like. Once we go through all that, we'll have successive drafts. So you and the general public will have an opportunity to comment on drafts, give us your feedback. As Lisa mentioned, we're going to test those. We're going to take hypothetical sites, run them through the new code, and see how that works and what the outcome is compared to what you have in place today. And then the third phase, once this is adopted, obviously it's got to go through City Council and get approved by City Council before it becomes the law of the land in Oklahoma City. We'll have some opportunities for training because, as I always tell people, the two things everybody hates are to probably get a sense of how things work, as painful as it might be. But you're going to need to learn, there'll be some language changes. There'll be some things that are different. You may be used to looking for information in one place. That'll change. So we're going to have some training sessions that tell people how to read and use the new code, and then finally implementation. So that's a brief overview of the process, and overlaying all of that will be various meetings with stakeholders, focus groups, and et cetera. So today, this is a get to know you session, kind of an introduction to the process. We're going to move on from here to signs, and our next meeting will take a deeper dive into sign regulations and what the new sign regulations might look like. Then we'll talk about districts, and hand in hand with districts, the design standards, what buildings and development sites look like and how they're designed. Then we'll talk about the processes for entitling development, all of those steps, and then we'll talk about development standards. That's everything from parking to landscaping to stormwater management to streets. All of that will be in one chapter, so you don't have to consult multiple chapters of a development code or even different documents. Like today, you jump from chapter 59 of the municipal code to the subdivision standards to figure out how you design an entire site. So as Lisa mentioned, that's all going to be vertically and horizontally integrated in the new code. At the end, we'll have a layperson's guide that tells people how the code works and what the outcomes are. And then an overview, the full development code update will finish off the process, this 3-year process that we're starting today, once we tie all of this together. So the next slide, the next set of slides are going to talk about signs. And you may be wondering, signs is a pretty specific issue, but it's important. It's important for businesses who want people to know where they are, why they should pull over if they're driving down a busy street and patronize their business, to people who want you to vote for a certain candidate or who want to bring attention to an issue, and for artists who want to communicate, what they do to the public. So things like murals and those sorts of things add life and vitality to buildings and sites. And so we want to make sure that signs become an asset for development, but that we also lay out, adequate opportunity for people to speak the way they want to. And I'm going to talk in a second about some specific policies in planokc about signs that followed a community appearance survey that was done several years ago that identified this community's likes and dislikes about signs around the city, from everything from how big and tall signs are to how they're designed to more modern and contemporary issues like lighting and digitalization of signs. We've had some applications recently in OKC that have been that have raised some issues at the council level that are kind of thorny, and so we want to sort through those. And the council recently put a moratorium on billboards and freestanding signs over 200 square feet using the PUD and SPUD process to entitle billboards that are taller than that. And so that's going to hold the line for the next 180 days while we sort through these issues and come up with a new set of sign regulations that are more workable and reasonable. And there's a lot of industry and business concerns. We've had a number of focus groups already, and we've talked to a lot of business people and sign makers and et cetera, and I'll talk about those in a second. So policy E14 and Plan OKC is very specific about signs. I thought that was kind of unusual. Most comprehensive plans don't get into even this level of detail about signs, but it was important enough that it found its way into your long-term planning policies. And there's some specific mandates here to deal with aesthetics and clutter while at the same time balancing that. And this is all a balancing act, you know, with the ability for businesses to identify themselves and for people to speak. And so one specific policy was to restrict new billboards or reduce their number. The second one was removing non-conforming billboards and trying to find ways to get older billboards that don't comply with our modern standards up to date, to consider new limits and new standards on size, height, number of signs, and to improve our enforcement practices and to be a little more proactive about that. And policy ST17, as you see, is also very specific and I think very wise in recognizing that signs are an important feature of site and building design. I've always felt that in retail centers, you know, and I've seen them be when they're newly built and the signs haven't been put on the buildings yet, they look kind of dead. I think signs are a great way, like I say, to add life and vitality to our streets and our buildings and our relationships with each other. But if there are too many, if they're not designed correctly, if they don't fit the context of development, they can create clutter and unsatisfactory appearance and traffic issues. So again, we want to balance all that and get that right. And what we want you to think about between this meeting and as we move on to the next meeting are the kinds of the features of signs that you like and that you think are as important. Maybe as a business person, maybe as just as a citizen, you know, interested in the appearance of the neighborhood around you. What are the things we need to pay better attention to? What are the things that don't work today? Maybe what are some new tools we need to put in place to deal with? And Lisa, if you could move to the next slide. To deal with like the area and height of signs. How tall should signs be in different parts of the city? What is the appropriate area of signs? How many signs should we allow per frontage? Where should we locate signs? What should the setbacks be? How many on a site? Pretty critical. What types of signs? Like a lot of cities around the country now, when they update sign regulations, no longer allow pull signs. They only allow signs on a solid base like the one you see here. Is that a direction that we should go in, or should we let the marketplace take care of that and just maybe consider better design practices for pole signs or covering the poles? What about sign materials? Should those match the building face? What do you think about sign illumination and digital signs, which is a way for businesses, for example, to communicate prices or different aspects of their business without having to constantly reface a sign? And it's a modern practice, but some people are concerned about that. Its impact on, for example, the night skies and those sorts of things. Should we think more about the copy type? Should we encourage things like channel letters and as opposed to just plain flat panels? What about moving parts? A lot of communities don't allow animated signs or signs that move. They feel like they create traffic issues. But is that something we could integrate better? What about portable signs? The city doesn't allow them today, and that's fairly common in modern sign regulations. But is that something we need to continue? Signs on public property in the right of way, and then temporary signs. You know, you've seen a lot of these feather banners around the city, I'm sure, and a lot of cities see those. Car dealerships a lot of times have that rotating balloon or the bowing balloon. Are those things we need to crack down on, or is that something we should let the marketplace control? So those are things to think about between now and the next time. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, we've had 10 focus groups already, along with some follow-up interviews. And when I did the slide, we'd had 7, so we've had 10 by now. We're having a couple more next week, where we've gotten a lot of input on what works, what things we should look at, things we should avoid, things that work for business and for the sign industry, and things that don't work. And so we've been listening and trying to make sure we get this right. You know, that's given us a lot of great input that will lead to a brand new sign ordinance that we'll be considering pretty shortly. So as I mentioned, some of the things we heard in the focus groups were to avoid unintended consequences, to provide better permitting processes, and it's something I heard from you all today just globally, to make sure our permitting processes work better for everyone. Make the standards more predictable, not rely so much on the PUD or the simplified PUD or SPUD process, which, as you know, PUD stands for paranoia, uncertainty, and delay. There are better ways to approve things and to create better sign standards by right. Allowing for flexibility. It's another thing I heard a lot today. You know, when we started this process, nobody could have imagined the pandemic that we're in. So we need to make sure that standards are flexible enough to allow for future changes like that. Now, allow them without a painful process, to improve enforcement, which is in the plan, to deal with things like landscaping and inspections, which can sometimes interfere with the message or cause permitting delays, and to create processes that are more efficient than what we see today, especially with the PUD being used as a vehicle sometimes to permit new signs. So with that, that'll lead you to what you're going to see next time, and I will turn it back to Lisa to talk about schedule and next steps.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
So back to when and how often the SAT needs to meet. We do anticipate it being every other month, but for this next meeting, we are asking everybody to convene about 3 weeks from now, Friday, June 19th in the afternoon. It appeared to me from the response to this meeting that even though it's summertime, Friday afternoons seem to work for most everybody. So I've gone ahead and set the next meeting for the 19th. If you could respond to me just, hey, Friday afternoons really don't work. I'd rather have Friday mornings or whatever your preference is. I've assumed since this next meeting will be on Zoom that wherever you are, that you will be able to join us. But please let me know if you generally have standing conflicts. Obviously, I'm trying to avoid council days and planning commission days since so many of our participants are involved in that. In general, I've tried to avoid, I want to avoid council weeks and planning commission weeks, although I realize the 19th is a council and planning commission week. But again, we think it's just so important that we get in front of you with some concrete sign code recommendations, because our goal is to get the sign code moving, and to do that we need to have a draft of it by the late summer. so that we can start some public meetings and get on to a final draft and adoption. So it is an aggressive schedule for signs. The staff and the consultant are committed to making it happen. We want to hit it hard. We definitely don't want to be careless about it. We want to make sure we have crossed T's, dotted I's, and we don't want to let our make any mistakes, in our haste to get it done. But if you've been following Planning Commission and Council, this is an important issue. So again, we'll plan on June 19th, and please let me know if in general you prefer Friday mornings or Friday afternoons. So with that, does anybody have any burning questions that we haven't answered and that you feel you need answered today?
Lisa, this is Janice Powers. I have one observation that I do feel a burning need to express, and that is, as we move forward with this process, and not just on the sign code portion of it, but throughout the process, I think it is very important for us to keep always in mind the process of code enforcement. We have a dismal history of it here in the city of Oklahoma City. And so I think not only do we need to keep in mind with everything that we propose or enact, how it's going to be enforced, if it's enforceable, and what that mechanism will look like. I just think that is going to be so important. I don't think it's going to do us any good to go through all of this to come up with a wonderful new code and then not to have any better ability to enforce it than we do now.
Thank you, Janice. Yes, that was one of the guiding principles, remains one of the guiding principles. And we did sit down with code enforcement in one of the focus groups. So hopefully we can improve that. Anyone else?
Hi, Lisa. Just to clarify, it seems like you said the next meeting wouldn't be till the 19th, but I had received an invite about next Friday.
That's the policy group, committee that's meeting separately from the SAT. I don't know if you were on the call I think you were. So the policy committee is the group of planning commissioners and city council members.
Yes.
And they are meeting separately.
And then I think Debbie Martin is reaching out to you.
Yeah, she called me this morning, and I told her I needed to think about what I thought the best approach was, because I understand that you cannot under any circumstances make that meeting.
Yeah, that's a Debbie thing. So.
Yeah, that's what. Yeah, she made that clear to me. So.
Otherwise, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions about the process, schedule, resources, which I'll take a minute to speak to that. I've set up a Microsoft Teams folder where staff will distribute pieces of information, drafts, resources for the team's review. So I'm putting together a kind of quick instructions for that because you've probably already received some mystery invitations. One from me saying that I've added you to a group. You probably received one from IT department saying that you have been added to a group. Those are legitimate. I'm going to send you some screenshots of what those look like. Teams is available on a desktop app and it's available on a mobile app. But again, I'm working on some information about how you access it and what's available. Right now, there are a couple of articles, white paper articles about signs. Those are for information only. The code diagnosis is in there also. And then planokc lives on its own website. But other than that, you're not missing anything in the folder yet. But we will circulate drafts on that folder. Anything else? If none of the team members have any questions or comments, I will move on to see if any members of the public would like to speak. If you would, please unmute yourself and state your name and feel free to make your comment. I don't think we have anybody on. So with that, we'll adjourn. And again, feel free to reach out to me at any time with questions or concerns. And please look for the next meeting invite on the 19th. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Elisa.
Thank you.
Thank you.